Man suspected of killing Trump supporter in Portland dies during arrest. After a summer of protests, counter-protests, looting, violence, and tempers at a fever pitch, it's a little surprising that there haven't been more deaths. The majority of the deaths seem to have been at the hands of officers. The death Thursday evening was also at the hands of law enforcement, but this time the man who was shot was armed. A federal task force attempted to arrest Michael Forest Reinoehl, 48, north of Portland, in Lacey, Washington. A senior Justice Department official said he was the suspect in the killing of Aaron J. Danielson, who had been participating in a show of support for Donald Trump last Sunday. Reinoehl had been located by the FBI and a U.S. Marshals Service fugitive task force after a warrant was issued for his arrest. He pulled a gun in the confrontation with law enforcement. Later, a U.S. Marshals Service statement said the task force attempted to peacefully arrest him. The statement said, initial reports indicate the suspect produced a firearm, threatening the lives of law enforcement officers. Task force members responded to the threat and struck the suspect, who was pronounced dead at the scene. Thurston County Sheriff's Lieutenant Ray Brady said 4 task force members fired their weapons. This included 2 Pierce County Sheriff's deputies, a Lakewood Police Department officer, and a Washington State Department of Corrections officer. Brady also said it hadn't been determined how many rounds were fired. The suspect was alone at the time. Brady does not believe Reinoehl lived at the address where he was shot, and it's not clear why he was in Lacey. "We don't know that specifically yet," said the lieutenant. "I do not believe that was his residence." In a social media post, Reinoehl had described himself as 100% Antifa, and he had been a regular at anti-racism protests in Portland. He compared counter-protester tactics to warfare. He'd tangled with police before and was also wanted on a warrant. In another conflict this summer, he'd been shot in the arm. On July 5, Reinoehl was cited for possession of a loaded gun in a public place, resisting arrest, and interfering with police. On July 26 he was shot in his arm after he'd been involved in an altercation with an armed white man and a group of young people of color. Aaron Scott Collins, the armed white man, said he and a friend had just left a bar when they saw an older black man being harassed. A friend began filming, and the group confronted them and called them Nazis. Reinoehl, with his arm wrapped, talked to the media later and said he didn't know what had started the altercation, but several intervened when they saw Collins fighting with minors. "As soon as the adults jumped in, he pulled out a gun," said Reinoehl. "I jumped in there and pulled a gun away from people's heads, avoided being shot in the stomach, and I got shot in the arm." Additionally, he was wanted on a warrant from Baker County in Oregon, with records showing he skipped a hearing related to a June charge of driving under the influence of controlled substances, reckless driving, reckless endangerment, and unlawful possession of a firearm. Police said he had been driving on an interstate at up to 111 miles per hour with his daughter while racing his 17-year-old son who'd been driving a different vehicle. Oregon Governor Kate Brown and other Democratic leaders called for an end to the violence on Thursday while federal agents were arresting protesters who'd allegedly assaulted law enforcement officers. "The violence must stop," wrote the governor. "There is no place for white supremacy or vigilantism in Oregon. All who perpetrate violent crimes must be held equally accountable." Her statement didn't single out the minority of protesters who'd been setting fires, vandalizing buildings, and throwing objects at officers. Her spokesman, Charles Boyle, said it is a collective call to action for an end to violence in Portland and affirms that those who commit violent acts must be held accountable. Her request was signed by more than 20 state and local politicians, as well as organizations that include the local NAACP chapter and the city's professional sports teams. Thursday night saw protesters returning to a law enforcement building in Portland they'd frequented. Police reported demonstrators threw objects at them and vehicles. One vehicle drove through the group, narrowly missing people, reported a police statement. The driver was later cited, and police arrested 2 other protesters. Other vehicles that had been used to block traffic were cited as well, and one was towed. Portland Police Chief Chuck Lovell also has denounced protesters who broke windows and set fire to a business in the apartment building where Mayor Ted Wheeler lives. The demonstrators had been upset with him for not stopping officers from using batons and tear gas against Black Lives Matter protesters. 74 people were facing federal charges as of a week ago for crimes that were alleged to have been committed during the protests that have been taking place in Portland since May 29, said U.S. Attorney Billy Williams.